Hello and welcome to Season 8, Episode 10 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And we are, of course, reading George Lakoff's Moral Politics, How Liberals and Conservatives Think, as he goes and talks about what he thinks are the worldviews behind liberal and conservative viewpoints, this time focusing on another specific current issue, I guess you could say, crime and the death penalty, or at least current 30 years ago. He's writing this back in 1996 or thereabouts, writing about crime and the death penalty and sort of what he saw as the conservative and liberal approaches to crime and punishment and things like that. Of course, I'm sure as we'll talk about, he gets a lot of things wrong, but, I think his explanations of the liberal side of things are a little bit more beneficial because those are honest and truer to what people actually believe, because he's just a crazy liberal himself and does not understand or is just lying about the conservative viewpoint, as we've been talking about.
Or the facts, which we'll get to momentarily. So I'm trying to decide if I want to be the angry reader or if I want to give him some credit. Which one would you prefer?
I mean, I think you're going to slip into angry no matter what. You might try to give him some credit, but you'll find something that makes you mad.
All right. Well, I'll try to start off nice.
All right.
So he is, the topics are crime and death penalty. And of course, this is a theory throughout the theme of this whole book, which is conservative bad, a strict father morality system, but you have this idea of personal responsibility and cause and effect punishment punishment.
And I think he even explicitly calls it behavioralist in this chapter. I think he used that word, which we've described it as. I don't think he's outright said that yet.
That is true.
But that's essentially what he boils down all of conservative thought on, is if you have bigger punishment, it'll condition people to not do the crime. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's just how all conservatives think, is a very simple cause and effect relationship, according to him.
Well, and he doesn't say it the same way, but he espouses the behavioralist theory of the nurturing mother theory for the liberals. He doesn't believe. I keep holding off on finding out any information about him personally, just to try to keep a clear head about what he's written. But I'm assuming he's an atheist because he doesn't seem to, and he doesn't have any religion or any first principles. He thinks that we're all bound by one or the other of these really behavioralist, these kind of, you're just determined to believe one way or the other based upon how you're raised, because that's what he's saying. And so, the crime and the death penalty, which is of course more complex than what he gives it credit to, because you have a weird, the death penalty in particular, you in crime issues, you've always had strange bedfellows, as they say, because you'll have sometimes extreme, like really super, well, you expect super conservatives, but they'd agree with civil libertarians about the death penalty because, thou shalt not kill is pretty prominent in conservative thought. Yes. And depending on how you look at that, there's a lot of anti-death penalty advocates that are Catholic, but they are very conservative with regard to other issues, especially abortion. And of course, they would see that as very consistent, being pro-life on both subjects. And then you have the people that are of the left who used to more generally despise the criminal justice system and the police, but now are like, go get them when it comes to any Republican. Not any Republican, any Trump-supporting Republican. Yes. So it's really got more convoluted and confusing since he wrote this book initially in the 1990s. There was a little bit more of a consistency, but it's never been completely consistent. And he doesn't. If you have a simplistic view of the world, and you're trying to explain it, either you're this or that, it's difficult to deal with those significant populations which are not consistent with that theory.
Well, and he starts off essentially summarizing, everything he's about to say, but he says, basically what I said earlier, strict father morality sees the cure for violent crime simply as strict punishment. The family demands that disobedience must be punished, preferably in a painful fashion with an instrument like a belt or a rod.
Preferably painful. We want to injure our children. Yes. But go ahead.
But then he goes on to say, conservatives claim that violent crime has been the result of permissive child-rearing practices. They claim that violent crime in later life is caused by lack of strict discipline at home, a lack of painful corporal punishment in response to disobedience, A mother's nurturance without a father's discipline, they imply, produces antisocial, uninhibited, violent children with no respect for law.
Yeah, the funny thing is that no conservatives really felt that the violent crime epidemic was because of the permissive child rearing practices. Instead, it's just the complete breakdown in any sort of societal control into the Lord of the Flies. So there's an overlap in saying these kids were not nurtured for violent crime. Violent, you can be antisocial without being violent. So I think when you see these silly campus protests, in a modern era, and there was always been stupid campus protests for people who've been coddled, and they're like, oh, I want to do something important. Okay. Are you going to get a job and serve people? No, I want to get out in the quad and hold a banner and yell and stink. But that's different. The kind of an antisocial, it doesn't have to be violent crime is different, and I don't think he recognizes that, but he does kind of summarize this, cause and effect, the punishment thing. And there is there's certainly, to his credit, there is more of an emphasis on if you punish crime more severely, you'll get less of it from the conservative thought. But he does summarize the, I think, wrong philosophy of the liberals. But I'm trying to remember. Okay, I don't need to argue with him. He's just trying to explain how they look at things.
And I think he is right to a degree with the conservative emphasis, like on needing a father and a mother in the household. I don't think he comes to it like through the right conclusion with we conservatives think that you need a very punishing figure in the household, but no, you need both,
right?
To have a as beneficial of a childhood as you can have.
Correct, and yes. And there's the practical side of even liberals and how they raise their own children as opposed to what they think the government should do. And so it's and I haven't written in my notes that both theories require a father and a mother. Well, now the liberals, you don't need one of each. You can have 5 chicks or whatever. But generally speaking, both theories rely upon a father and a mother raising the child or children in the home, and have a consistent philosophy of either the strict father theory or the nurturant parent theory that he talks about. So both of his theories assume a stable and healthy family as being productive and beneficial. I think he's right that people generally believe that. I don't think he likes to explore that other than to say, well, conservatives are against single parents or whatever. But he does, I do think he does a really good job on 198 when he starts summarizing the left-wing thought on this, which is beneficial because I guess my instinct is to argue with them, but if you really want to try to convince them to support a certain public policy, you're not trying to convince them they're wrong. It's good to know how they view things. And I think when he talks about, children who are antisocial or violent or whatever, from a left-wing point of view, he views the neglect, or the liberals view, as he says, neglect is a form of violence. And you see this attitude in modern day, speech is violent, and silence is violence. Yeah. And it's absurd to think that.
But that's he tacks that on as well.
Yes.
He says painful corporal punishment teaches violence, and violence begets violence. Children who are made to submit through pain to the will of a parent are taught to make others submit to them through the use of violent methods. And he goes on and says neglect is a part of that.
Correct.
And I think that, especially like what you're saying, that neglect side has become more and more prominent over the past 30 years. Like if you're not raising them according to this codex of our values, then you are causing violence upon your child, and you're going to make them hate people later on in life.
Yeah, and I've often heard of, and maybe you have a different memory as one of my children, but we didn't generally use corporal punishment. We used different types of strict punishment, but you always hear, well, if you smack your kid, you're teaching them violence is a solution, and you'll have more violent children. But I don't know that there's actually any studies that prove that. I mean, there's people that say they have a study, but I don't know that they really prove. Now, when you actually abuse them, which is different than discipline. And in Missouri, well, like a lot of states, corporal punishment is permitted. So like there's an exemption or affirmative defense for a parent disciplining a child, even with like the proverbial switch, go get a branch and whatever, and I'll smack you with it. But it can't be for the purpose of causing pain. And so it's really hard to prosecute those cases when it's discipline originally, but you got broken bones. That's not discipline. That's just you're just a child abuse.
Yeah, this is sort of a tangent. But back when I was living up in Kirksville, there was a huge Congolese population. Straight like very recent immigrants from Africa, and they would get CPS called on them fairly frequently. Like it was a decent problem because they were so used to corporal punishment.
Right.
And I don't know every case. Maybe some of them were going too far, but it was like all of these Kirksville residents or these college students would hear stories. Oh, you slapped your child. That's abuse. And it's like, no, it's just how we do it. Back in the Congo.
You.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. It's more traditional outlook on those things, and you have a different attitude. And and living next door to a college professor, you're not going to have the same attitude about things. But he does. He mentions liberals respond that violence among fatherless children living in high crime districts is a result of one or more of the following. All right, so this is his theory of why you have violence in some areas. Mothers who act like abusive strict fathers. So women who act like men, administering corporal punishment, etc. Mothers who are neglectful, or social causes such as poverty or peer pressure. And the long-term cure for violent crime, liberals argue, this is from the book, nurturant environments in which there are no neglectful or abusive strict parent models, and 2, the reduction or elimination of poverty by the provision of job training and jobs themselves. So. And so I'm trying to stay focused on that description and not like argue in my mind how simple-minded those proposed solutions, which was what we've been trying to do since the 1960s as government policy. But that certainly is how they view it. And so if you're going to try to get something passed, like say in Congress, and the nation's divided 50-50, it would really be important for politicians to read these portions of the book to say, okay, what they want is for this nurturing government programs, and if they work, I think you can get conservatives to go along with you. Like say you're cutting out all this other nonsense, make work programs or things that make things worse, and if you combine that with something that has this explained as a nurturing service, you might be able to get some sort of bipartisanship, and so maybe we can learn a little bit from that, and not argue, well, that's kind of nonsense. It's not a cause and effect for what this breakdown is in certain high crime areas. And
I think he's spot on in his description there too. I think that's exactly how they view it, and exactly how they kind of get around. The absentee father might lead to lower education rates and higher crime rates, and say, well, that's a result of a lot of factors. Living in these areas, and so, well, maybe some things are causing other things, and it's all involved there. And we can look at some things that are more concrete than others, rather than just saying, look at everything else.
Yes, and of course, the counter argument about the poverty is, well, if you look at statistics, if you have a married couple, parents, if the parents are married, heterosexual married couples who have children are not in poverty generally. They're certainly better off than single parents, and they have better outcomes for the children by a large margin if you have intact nuclear households. So so maybe the conservatives need to really focus on that nurturing of the nuclear family, and to encourage it, and blah 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 blah. Yes. So I think point well taken on that.
And then he goes on to gun control, and I think he's spot on again about
how to describe how they look at it.
Yes, because he says, guns contribute to a cycle of violence. Guns are not intended just for target practice or sport. They are intended to hurt or kill people. The very presence of a gun evokes scenarios in which guns are used.
Yes.
And I think, and I'd never thought of it that way, but I think that's exactly how liberals think of it. They see a gun, it's like, oh, well, that must be used right now to kill somebody, and you are a dangerous person for having it. Maybe not right now, but it does evoke that idea.
It's like when they see a bouquet of flowers, they know before they get there it's going to smell like roses, And the same thing if they see a gun. Oh, you have a gun. Oh, that's an instrument of violence. It's almost like a religious icon. Like if I saw in somebody's house an upside down cross, I know danger.
Yeah.
I'm not going in. That's a bad person. That person is doing bad things. I think a gun is very similar to that as what my reaction would be. And you see that on people.
Yeah.
People that don't have guns and are really for gun control, and they really, it's like a religious, like an anti-religious icon to us.
And I've had conversations like that in college, usually with foreign exchange students, because even
in Europe,
or Europe or Asia. It's like, you're American. Have you shot a gun? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, oh, that's a scary thing that you've done. I'm like, well, a lot of people do it.
Well, this is the best thing to do is to take them to a gun range, and they will love it. They will love it. I'll just leave it at that. Like foreign exchange students, if you can get permission for it, those teenagers love it. Universally. Like, you want to shoot a gun? Really? Yeah. Yes. And like some European countries, well, I don't know how many of them still have it, but they have like the mandatory military service, so they're used to having guns in that manner.
Yeah, it's not many. I know Finland does, and a couple like Eastern European, but I don't think many Western European countries do anymore.
But anyway, so back to where we're at. So so he mentions, that the strict father theory is that, you got to defend yourself and defend your family and all that kind of stuff. So you need the guns because it's part of your responsibility, which is a true statement.
It's a symbol of the power of the strict father. Because again, his whole theory is based on keeping the power and status quo is what he sees conservative thought as.
And he says, the very good reason why it is conservatives who support the right to bear arms at a time when conservatives are down in general on rights, as liberals have defined them, e.g., the right to decent standard of living, the right to an education, and the like. Of course, I mention it's also in the Constitution, which those things are not. Perhaps. Maybe.
And it's also, those are very different types of rights. It's, I forget the words, but we were talking about that
a while ago. It's not a right from government interdiction. It's a claimed right that the government has to do things for you.
Because we're not saying the government should provide a gun for everybody. Like they say, the government should provide the funding for education for every individual.
Now, I have come around to believing that the federal government should supply firearms to or tax credits for all purchases of firearms for everybody that is legally able to have a firearm. Why not? We're going to fund everything else. Why wouldn't we fund that? True. I want a grenade launcher. I'm just joking. I don't need that. But so I don't even know if I want to mention this, but he says, and the reason why advocates of the right to bear arms are often violently anti-communist is because of this strict father morality, and that's why they're against the income tax. I don't know if it has anything to do with anything, but he mentions it as a slur, so to speak, to his people. Now, I don't know if you knew about this crime, the crime in general section. He mentions the 3 strikes and you're outlawed.
I think we've talked about this this season. Yeah.
So this was a law in California that your third felony offense, you got like 25 years to life. If I remember correctly.
That's what he says in the book, 25 to life.
This was in California, okay? And the funny thing is, once that was passed, crime went down, as you might expect. And generally, is my understanding, and of course I don't practice law in California, and I didn't at the time, but generally, the prosecutors use that as a tool, like as a bargaining tool. Those recidivists it's like the Terminator. They will not stop. They do not feel any pity or remorse. They will not stop until you're dead. Well, there's some criminals that seem to have an attitude that they're the Terminator of crime. They will just keep committing crime. And they absolutely will not stop unless you put them in a cell, and it's sad, but that's what the motivation behind that was, because they just had these recidivists. We're seeing this all across the country now, and so that's what he's talking about.
But then he says, why do they do so? I support the 3 strikes and you're outlaw in the face of evidence that having more people in prison does not reduce crime.
Yeah. So if Thomas Sowell was writing this book, he would have the cite for this claim. He would say, okay, here's the census data, here's the X, Y, and Z. this shows it doesn't reduce crime. Well, this author doesn't do that because he's lazy, and he's wrong. Okay, because there's direct evidence that it does reduce crime. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but there's a direct correlation.
And he's also not looking at exactly the same statistic. He's not looking at the results of the 3 strikes and you're outlaw. He's comparing prison population to crime rates, which is a different statistic to be looking at. But then he goes on.
And there's a lagging indicator because you have to lock them up first, and then the crime, you can get control over the neighborhoods so that you're free, to go to the store. And all
but then he says the state of Minnesota's Kids First program, which stresses daycare, education, community involvement, has succeeded in crime prevention at a much lower cost than running prisons. Why has this model not been supported by conservatives? Again, just laying these things as if they're facts without really backing it up. You're saying, well, this is better. Why don't they support it? Because they're stupid.
And I have to confess, I didn't even bother looking up the Kids First program for Minnesota because I know it's going to say cost overruns and a lack of statistical evidence of success. Now, I'm just saying that, but he's just saying that it worked. So I might as well just say it didn't work.
I'll look up while you're talking.
Yeah. But he talks about, that. So that's really how, and he's right about this again. Liberals see crime as having social causes: poverty, unemployment, alienation, and lack of caring in community, and argue that the social programs are needed to address those social causes. He's absolutely right that that's what they believe. And they think that you need all these social programs, these job programs, these drug treatment programs. You have to have those in place before you could ever possibly reduce crime, and that locking people up does not do anything. It's just this punishment, this heartless punishment that the conservatives think. And I think he's right that that's how they view things. And he says conservatives don't believe in social causes of crime or in any other social causes. Let's consider why. I'm like, where does that come from? Yeah. He's asserting it again, and then he says, let's talk about why. So there's no support for this statement, but he says it. So there we are. Yes. So now he's going to talk about class and social causes. Did you find anything else?
I couldn't find much. I could only find the official website, like 5 links down. So it doesn't seem terribly popular, and seems to just be like housing assistance and stipends and things like that. Yeah, so
it's probably something. It was
very successful.
It's probably very, very high profile when he wrote the book, so he put it in there. I mean, it seems to be his MO. All right, so. He says, conservatives tend not to use explanations based on concepts of class and social causes, nor do they recommend policy based upon those notions, which is, I think, very funny to read this now, because this is actually Trump's, it explains a lot of Trump's popularity is that he is talking about class, and he's not talking about race. He's talking about how the Washington people and the wealthy people are taking advantage of you, and I'll be your defender and all that kind of stuff. So he talks about the class issues, and there's a lot of conservative thinkers now that talk about class, but it's not about class grievances like the workers must unite, like communist. And so I think that's what he's talking about there. But he does say, liberals use these concepts all the time because they're Marxist, and it's the class struggle against the evil wealthy, which is, he has, 15 different references to that in his own, his own beliefs that are peppered throughout this thing.
Class structure comes with the notion of an upper class with wealth and power that wants to maintain its privileges, a lower class, the cheap labor of the upper class, held down and kept subservient to the upper class, and a middle class caught in between, aspiring to the upper class and afraid of falling into the lower class, et cetera, et cetera. So he's kind of just saying that these are true things without really diving into it, which is, of course, just Marxist rhetoric here.
And it's frustrating to listen to or to read because he is similar to other thinkers that think that there's no mobility between one or the other.
Yeah.
There are people that are very wealthy at points in their lives, and then their business fails, and then they're down at the bottom, and then they go back up or they don't go back up, and vice versa. So when you talk about the class struggle in a mobile, growing economy, that's just not the case, but that is true. That he's correctly stating, of course, his own personal beliefs and just asserting them as true. Yes. He doesn't say there's opinions. He always talks about the opinions of conservatives, but he asserts as fact that he says social justice demands that the lower class be paid more, live under better conditions, and be given maximal opportunities to work their way out of poverty. Opportunities for education and job training, for example.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, it reminds me a lot. I have a friend who graduated from Truman who was going into a master's program afterwards. She was a linguistics student on the idea of, there's no notion of mobility between the classes. And she wanted to conduct a research project sort of studying the language between groups of people who had moved from a lower class community to an upper class community or middle class somewhere therein or vice versa.
It's kind of like Caddyshack. You ever see that movie? Rodney Dangerfield?
No.
You should see it.
But she was denied multiple times. Like, granted, that'd be a very hard project to conduct for sure,
Yeah,
but that wasn't their complaint.
Yeah.
The professor's complaint wasn't that it'd be very difficult. It was just, why would you want to do that? And they kept recommending her, well, why don't you, since you're interested in like sociolinguistics, why don't you look at some things, related to LGBT communities and how they speak in relation to everybody else, because that's must be what you're interested in. If you're a linguistics student, she just got so frustrated with it. And while she was at Truman, she did a project on biblical translations and like the different words used there, which is very interesting, very linguistics focused.
Right.
Everybody thought it was like stupid. They all kind of brushed it aside. These professors and these other grad students that she was working with. It's just like, why would you do something like that? And it's like, that sounds more interesting than any of the other projects that they were doing.
I think it would be interesting to see if the people that are upwardly mobile use almost better vocabulary, or used a different types of terminology in their conversation to make a better impression almost into a different class, so to speak. It'd be fascinating.
It would be very, very fascinating, but they wanted nothing to do with it.
You'd almost, I don't know how you'd structure it. You'd have to do a lot of interviews. First, you have to define the group, I guess. Anyway, I don't have to go down that path. But it's fascinating.
Yeah.
But
they did not think so.
Yeah, because they probably didn't want the evidence. Either the evidence for that there is mobility, or the evidence why some populations aren't as mobile as others.
Well, this is also kind of another tangent. I'm the one going on tangents today, but I went to the bookstore in town.
Did you? When? Today?
No, a few days ago.
I wasn't with you.
Well, you were at work.
Yeah.
I also didn't go to the record store with you yesterday.
That's
besides the point.
That's the day before yesterday.
Or the day before yesterday, yeah, you're right. And I saw a book. I forget the title of it. It's sitting in that drawer over there. Maybe I'll pull it out in a second. But it's essentially about, it was written like 2003, and it's about like the degradation of language and about, how language and music, tied together, sort of, not being used in a very eloquent way and things like that, and how that can affect society. And I looked at the author, and the author sounded very familiar. He's John McWhorter. And I know, and I knew his name, not too well, but he was referenced in a lot of my linguistics classes because he was a very big guy in terms of like looking at Black African American English, and he was a very big proponent of like, well, this is a fully formed language; it's not like a deficient language, and that was the only thing I knew about him. I had no idea he'd written anything about how we should be using better language in everyday life and stuff like that. What I was told about him was sort of the backing of that relativist idea of, well, we can't really define what language is. That's what my professors told me about him was, well, if you look at, African American English, you can't say it's bad, and therefore, all language has to be the same. You can't impose rules on anything. And I come and I find this book, and he's writing about the terrible effects of language degradation. Now, we should be using better language.
Interesting.
And it's like, it's that sort of divide in linguistics where it's like, we want to emphasize, however we can, that sort of relativist idea, and then sort of diminish everything else that goes against that, even if it's from the same author.
Yeah, that's wild.
And he's a generally like liberal person.
I have a Tolkien segue based on that's relevant to what you're saying.
That's incredible.
Ian, what's his name, played Gandalf. McClellan? No,
McKellen. Yes, Ian McKellen.
Ian McKellen is still acting, by the way.
Yeah,
I thought he was dead, but he's alive,
still alive,
and he was performing some sort of performance, of course.
That's what you do.
So they interviewed this guy. He's like 80-something.
Oh, yeah, he's great.
And he mentioned, I think as an aside, and I agree with him, he said he was talking about we need to have more eloquent speech, and especially from our political leaders. And he mentioned, he's watched some Trump speeches. And he's very critical of the language he uses, and it's true because Trump's superpower is dumbing down his speeches.
Yes.
He uses the same terms over and over again. He speaks at like a third grade level or something, but that it's so clear though. He's not talking about highfalutin words. But anyway, so he just yesterday, I think, made that same criticism you talked about in that book, where he wants us all to improve our language and how we express ourselves, so that we're not just dumbing everything down to the lowest common denominator. Now, he was critical of Trump's speech. He didn't mention one way or the other, I don't think, about Biden, but who would need to.
Yeah.
So there you go.
No,
we haven't had a Tolkien reference.
We haven't
yet this
in a
season,
while.
So I didn't even think to fit that in until you mentioned your aside.
He's a very funny guy. I've seen clips of interviews with him. He's like being interviewed. I don't know if the interviewer was in on the joke, but he's like, what is the secret to acting? How do you act so well? And he's talking in terms of Gandalf. He says, well, the way I approach a role is I try and pretend to be the character in the script. And they give me a list of lines to read, and I memorize them, and I say them like the character. He says, Ian, Gandalf, and I read the lines, and then I go back to Ian. So funny. It's great. It's a really great clip.
That
Yeah.
That's great. Sometimes it can be so funny to answer a question as it was asked honestly.
Yes.
Like the most basic answer. Which I think is funny.
Yes.
Well, I was watching a little clip of the WNBA's in the news now because of Caitlin Clark, and there's these controversies. I think a lot of it is just ginned up. But there was I don't even know who it was. I don't care who it was. I don't know if it was a player or a coach. But it was like one of those press conferences. It has nothing to do with Caitlin Clark. But it was, like the comment on it was, this is why everybody should hate the WNBA, whatever. But this player or coach was asked, well, what do you think the bench needs to do to improve? Last game they did this, and this game they did X. And she says, what? And he said, well, what does the bench players, the players coming off the bench, what do they need to do better at the next game than they did this game? And she says, well, what did they do last game? He says, well, they did very well. They scored blank points. Okay, and what did they do this game? And he says, well, they didn't score any. She says, there you go. So it's like, it was such a stupid question. Like, of course, they need to play better.
Yes.
That's what they needed. They need to score points, and they need to defend better. They need to steal the ball. I mean, what kind of stupid question is that? And people were critical of her because she was really just fed up with the stupid question. Sure. But anyway, so I thought that was funny too. It's similar to what Ian did, but I think he sounded he was funny. She was not trying to be funny. That was for sure. She was very angry. Anyway.
Yes, but back to social class and everything.
Yes.
Because what he says, he keeps describing it. Everybody's heard the class theory at this point.
Yes.
But he says the whole picture is simply inconsistent with strict father morality in the conservative worldview. It defines, in that worldview, the class hierarchy is simply a ladder there to be climbed by anybody with the talent and self-discipline to climb it. That's why he says all conservatives are opposed to things like communism and these social programs because it defies their what he says in between the lines, their incorrect worldview.
And the poor are poor because they're moral defects and all that stuff.
As all conservatives believe.
And people are poor and other people are rich because that's how God ordained it.
As all good conservatives from the year 400 BC think. I think is what he's talking about here.
Yeah, and when he mentions this, and he just asserts these things. I mean, I'm trying not to be critical of him, but I'm going to be. It's 204, the end of this section, he says, the logic of conservatism locates so-called social, quote, problems within people, not within society. Well, I think there's some truth to that because each one of us are individuals free to choose, and we're not all just 100% victims of the class or where we're born, but let's do play an influence. A role in the government can certainly suppress growth and development, which all conservatives believe. With higher taxation and more regulation. I mean, if conservatives really had this view that success was only based upon your morality or laziness or whatever. Or as ordained by God, then why would they advocate for less regulation and less taxation to unleash the beast of the American entrepreneur, as Romney would say?
Well, it's almost like conservatives believe that we're part of like a 2,000-year-old like philosophical, theological, and moral and legal tradition that asserts that the individual is responsible for his or her own actions, and therefore that is what we base almost everything in our lives on. Is the individual has the freedom to choose what to do. Not as if they're bound to whatever circumstances are around them. But I think that'd be crazy.
False, says George Lakoff.
Yes. We just believe in mean punishment, I think.
So then he has a very brief, like less than 1 page mention of nurture and nature. And I don't think he clearly doesn't talk about some subjects because it cuts both ways. You know, like this nurture versus nature, or nature and nurture. I don't even know what to talk about this, but he's talking about, you know, moral order is a natural order. You know, the strict father theory thinks that, you know, there's a strain of conservatives that uses nature as well as environmentally determined factors as a means of explaining explanation for social programs. He mentions again the book The Bell Curve, and don't read The Bell Curve in mixed company because it's considered racist because it says certain things about the IQ of blacks, the problem is, I think that if you control for other factors, it doesn't really say anything about blacks. It says people about a certain neglect and lack of education in a large segment of the population. But be that as it may, the liberals hate it because they think it's an argument that that African Americans or blacks can't perform as well as whites, and so they're very afraid of the Bell Curve book. Yeah. But I have not read it myself, but it was a big thing in the 90s because it's very controversial. But the liberals always think it says more than it says.
Yeah, and he seems to be referencing that because he says
all over and again. Yes.
You know, the explanation for the economic failure of blacks is lack of talent. By talent, he means like natural inherent qualities. Right. But if that can't be proved, there's always lack of character as an explanation. So they're always, you know, still just kind of racist against black people because if you can't prove it's natural talent, you can say, well, it's just the character of those people, you know, not just their inherent, you know, genetic whatever. Because, you know, that's what all conservatives believe, according to Lakoff.
You know, it's I think, you know, there are two modern tragedies in American society that people will look back in 100 years and they'll wonder, why didn't you fix this? And one's going to be abortion for sure, and the other one's going to be the violent crime epidemic and the neglect of African American children, especially boys. And I don't know what the solution is, but certainly we need to do something different because you know, in an individual case, you know, every person can make their own choices, but man, we are just screwing over these children. You know, I mean, they're growing up in basically war zones. A lot of kids, depending on the neighborhood, and that's not acceptable. And part of the solution, of course, is to lock up the older ones and the adults and get them out of that community, or maybe get the kids out of the younger kids out of the community. I don't know. But something needs to be done, and it's not about their inherent character. It's not about their inherent and God-given talent as a group. But you know, you put this many pressures on any group of people, and it's going to be very hard to overcome it, especially when you don't have like you can put that kind of pressure on the traditional historical Jewish communities, which were like enclaves, and they very much supported themselves, and they valued industriousness and education like almost above everything else as a culture, like a subculture, and so there's a lot of issues with that, but yeah, he just wants to defame conservatives. As if we don't care, we just want to write people off and just define them out. So then he talks about preventing crime. So I don't even know if I want to talk about his descriptions of conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we kind of talked about it already. It's, you know, conservatives assume that if crime is punished harshly enough, it will end because, you know, there will be a strong enough disincentive to keep them from committing crimes. You know, it's again just that idea: if you hit them hard enough, they'll stop doing it. You know, of course, that's the whole conservative moral tradition.
So let's skip that because it just makes me angry.
Yes.
And then he talks about liberals believing in social causes, and of course he brings up the favorite program of all liberals everywhere, Project Head Start, which is a complete waste of money. Because it provides high quality daycare for poor working parents. It doesn't. Okay. It just doesn't. And it doesn't make any long-term difference in their educational or work outcomes. It just isn't. And then he talks about, you know, it costs more to lock people up than it does to attend an Ivy League college. Not anymore.
Yeah, because he says, what does he say? It costs more than $20,000 a year to house one prisoner for a year. The cost of tuition at an Ivy League college. I don't think that's that's an accurate statistic.
Well, it might have been in the 1990s, but it's Ivy League's what, $100,000 a year. No, it might cost. It costs maybe more than $20,000, depending on the prison. But the costs have not risen as great as the anyway. So he talks about a cost benefit analysis, but he doesn't even use accurate numbers. But he talks about, first there's social causes, so you got to have government programs, and the government programs are more cost effective, which he has no cites for, except for a New York Times article from 1995.
Yes, and that's not even about.
But that's just talking about cutting funding for Head Start and increasing funding for the military or whatever.
Yes.
That doesn't even say that, hey, if we increase funding in this, we'll have X number of less people in prison.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't work, and nobody's done the work to study that anyway.
It is interesting to see here because this is before, I think you've seen a lot of the theories of, or the sort of radical ideas of a lot of liberals now that we need to, defund all prisons, and all prisons are inherently immoral. And you can kind of see that, latent under here. I mean, it definitely wasn't an idea as he's writing back then in the 90s, but the idea that, well, if we just move this money to other things and just completely get rid of prisons altogether, then we'll just have this incredible moral utopian population. So it's interesting to see that here, that he's not quite there yet, but you can see how that comes out of this.
Yes. So he talks about the death penalty, and he says the death penalty, liberals argue, has been shown not to be a deterrent to murders. And he kind of says sarcastically, murders apparently do not do a cost-benefit analysis before killing someone, and so the death penalty does not deter them. That's an assertion, and I think he's being a smartass.
Yes.
But I think he doesn't understand how rational criminals are in a cost benefit analysis. But also, this, and I can talk about the death penalty. I could do a whole season on it, and I'm a little conflicted on the subject. I'm even though I've been involved in some death penalty litigation, I'm not 100% on board with it. Oddly enough. But and by the way, one of the guys, they just got an execution date reinstated for him in September. So I've got to make some tough calls about that one. But anyway, so this is if you're just going to talk about the practical effect of not having the death penalty versus having the death penalty, and I don't think anybody else. I don't know if anybody else even talks about this, but there's a going rate. So like, for a crime in your community, let's say a burglary, first offender burglary is going to have generally, unless there's some weird thing, you kind of want to treat people generally the same that are similarly situated. So they probably get probation, pay restitution, maybe some shock time at most. First time offender, young person, no violence, nobody's home when they break into the house.
Sure.
But if you say you have different factors, say they stole firearms, well, that's a little more dangerous because they're stealing it maybe to sell it or to use it in other crimes. So you may have an upcharge there. If somebody's home, it's a different type of burglary. It's a burglary first because it's more dangerous when you're breaking a home and somebody's there. So there's some that'll be treated a little more leniently, some will be treated more harshly depending on the circumstances or their criminal history. So that same concept applies to first-degree murder cases. So do you want me to go through this or not?
Sure.
So not all killings are crimes. So there's exemptions for self-defense. There's also accidents, like if you're in a car accident and it's not your fault. And the other person, I had one that was that I reviewed years ago that a person was driving a car. There was a T-bone intersection with a motorcycle. The motorcyclist died at the scene, and the family's upset that the car driver was not charged. Well, it turned out the motorcyclist was speeding, failed to yield, and was lit up on over-the-limit alcohol and a whole bunch of cocaine. Now, maybe some of that evens it out. I don't know, because one's a stimulant, one's a depressant. But the bottom line is that person was responsible for their own death. Yes. So not all death is a crime, and not all killings are murder. Some are manslaughters. If you don't intend to kill them, if you just commit, it's criminal negligence. It's a murder second at Missouri law. If it's reckless, it's a manslaughter. First, if you kill somebody in a heat of passion, you come home and you find your wife in flagrante delicto, so to speak, and you murder them, and you weren't even thinking about it. It's sudden passion, but you really intended to kill them. You're shooting them. Yeah.
And that seems to be what he's kind of talking about here with the murderers do not do a cost-benefit analysis. The sort of
so there's defenses for those. So then you get to intentional killings. That's a murder in second degree where you intend to kill somebody, but you didn't deliberate on it, before you killed him, but you intended to kill him, that's not death penalty eligible. Okay. So that's a murder second degree. You're looking at life in prison with the possibility of parole for a standard murder second, where you're intended to kill them, you killed them. Okay. But you didn't have a plan. You didn't think about it ahead of time. You know, they pissed you off and you killed them, but you didn't really think it through. A murder in the first degree is you killed somebody after deliberation. Deliberation in Missouri law is after considering the matter for a period of time, no matter how brief. And I always snap my fingers because that's what you do in your closing arguments.
Yes.
But in any event, so then it's a murder in first degree. That only gets you life without parole. You have to have other factors in order to get the death penalty that are also proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a second phase of the trial, which is you're killing them because they're a witness to another crime, or you're killing them, or there's multiple people killed in the same murder spree, or it involves depravity of mind, torture, something that the depravity of mind instruction is the closest thing we have to a moral aggravator, which is of any crime, is that you showed such disregard for the sanctity of human life. It shows evidence that you have a depraved mind, and that's an aggravator. But it has to be your act. So anyway, so then you get to the possible death penalty. But anyway, so as a prosecutor, you have, if you're in a big jurisdiction, you're going to have a lot of murders. You're going to have a certain number of murders you're going to handle during your career. So the worst of the worst gets the death penalty, if the death penalty is around. Then the people that are pretty bad, but are not the worst of the worst, they get life without parole.
Yes, and I will just say
and then you get down to the people that are below that, they get life with parole. And then maybe 25 years, and then 20, and then so on. You take death penalty off the top, guess what? Everybody gets downgraded one. Yeah. So then your worst of the worst gets life without parole. And then the other, everything just drops down a whole notch. And that's important when you're dealing with crime at all levels, because it all goes all the way down to DWIs, because everybody's comparing what they're getting to somebody else. And so that level of justice and that level of punishment, or the consequences are necessarily reduced for everybody if you don't have the top level. Yeah. But he asserts that the death penalty doesn't deter crime, but you know what? He doesn't value the fact that in the other argument for the death penalty that I don't see argued very often is that it actually increases the value we place upon innocent life. And I know it's kind of counterintuitive, but if we're allowing people to rape and torture a 6-year-old girl, which is one of the cases I was involved in, and he got executed last year. If we're going to let that guy live forever until God calls him home, so to speak, aren't we kind of devaluing how precious the life was that he took? I mean, shouldn't we have some punishment that's pretty bad, short of torture? And then, of course, there's the arguments of if you're not going to have the ultimate punishment for the worst of the worst, you're risking vigilantism, which is actually what we have is the biggest part of the problem in our high crime areas. Is they don't even report it to the police because they don't find any justice in the court system, and so they just take matters in their own hands. Yes. Anyway, so that's my rant on all that stuff. Yes, and I am a death penalty supporter generally. And I don't know how much of an advocate I am for it, but those are all very, I think, somewhat complex issues. And you can argue the opposite side of every one of those things I just said. I'm not saying I know I have the right answer, obviously, but he tries to just simplify both sides of the argument. And a lot of conservatives are pro-life and anti-death penalty, a ton of them. And what I said in my job interview when I was hired, I said, I don't know that I like the death penalty in a republic. And I remember it was Bob McCullough, and he kind of looked at me like I was a retard. and he says, what? I said, well, if you have a republic made up of citizens, I don't know that it's appropriate for the state, the government that the people made, killing one of its own. It's like you're a member. You shouldn't be able to be revoked by the thing that you created. But anyway.
Yes. So much more complex than he says, of course. Yes. And much more complex than just, murderers don't do a cost-benefit analysis. When of course
a lot of them do.
A lot of them do.
The murder for hire people certainly do. The murder for hire people not only do a cost-benefit analysis on the potential punishment, they do a cost-benefit analysis on who they're going to hire. Because they'll negotiate. Those murder for hire, when they get caught and they're on tape, they will negotiate the price they're paying. That's how how premeditated and the cost benefit analysis they do. I don't know if I want to pay $20,000. That's a lot of money. Well, you're gonna get the life insurance. Remember, we're gonna make it look like an accident. Oh, okay, yeah, okay, 20. How about 18? And they'll negotiate it down by like $500 increments, and that's great evidence. And this is where you know it's happening, and so you have an informant. You're not going to, it's one of those conspiracy cases. But it's fascinating to listen to those interviews, and that's great evidence to show the intent and also the depraved indifference to human life. That is evidence when you're saying, well, I'm willing to pay $19,500 to kill this person, but not $20,000. $500 just isn't going to get it done. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes. I mean, that's just kind of what I was saying.
Yes.
Is that he's very simplistic, very very simplistic.
And the liberals, he talks about the liberals' feelings about the death penalty run much deeper than that.
Well, yes, because of course the conservatives are just more punishment equals more good.
Nurturance itself implies a reverence for life, which I'm like, what happened to abortion? Anyway, which is a form of the unconditional love of the nurturant parent for their children. And he talks about the government should be a nurturant parent of these murderers. And I think, it's kind of like similar to the republic shouldn't kill one of its own, or the government shouldn't kill its own in a republic. But, he even mentions in here, infanticide. And I just thought that was kind of funny, but
because that's what he compares the death penalty to is infanticide. Because, of course, going back, to either last episode or the episode before, we're talking about that they see a lot of criminals as just infants, helpless children.
Right.
And so if you are using the death penalty, that's the state, committing infanticide, these poor, helpless, innocent souls that couldn't help themselves.
Of course, now the nurturant liberals are in favor of legalizing infanticide. Literally.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, up to like a couple weeks after birth. It's crazy.
Yes.
So anyway, he talks about, and he does, to his benefit, he talks about liberals finding the death penalty uncivilized, which I think is true. And he says, this I think is true. Arguments against the death penalty are not just about the death penalty itself. Very true. They are emblematic of a broader issue. They're about how the state should be conceptualized and how it should function in general.
Yes, which is exactly what you were saying earlier with, should a republic have that power?
Yes.
But then, of course, he dumbs the question down to, conservatives like, harsher punishments, and they just respect power more. And if there's more power to the state, then that is how the state should function. It will make things better, because that's how all conservatives think. That is the conservative intellectual and moral tradition. And there's nothing more to it than that.
He does a real disservice to liberals in how they view the death penalty, because there are some principled arguments, or at least he could have elaborated more on, the love, the nurturant love of even the worst of the criminals that shouldn't have the ultimate punishment, applied to them. And he could have spelled that out more. I mean, his death penalty section was like maybe a page and a half, if that.
It was just
and his
surprising.
The chapter is called partially named in the death penalty.
Yeah.
He didn't even really talk about it. But whatever.
Which is interesting. Because, it's such a varied thing. I mean, the Catholic Church now, is opposed to the death penalty in all cases. In all cases,
which it's, and I understand the theories behind that, but I don't know how you can change a fairly fundamental teaching of the Catholic Church like that. Yeah. It's been, it was, a Catholic philosophy and official church teaching that the death penalty was appropriate in some circumstances for over 2,000 years, consistently. Pope John Paul came close, but he said, basically, if there's really no other alternatives, the death penalty is okay. And it really puts a lot of pressure on, okay, what do you mean if there's no other alternatives? When you have a sophisticated prison state, you can always lock them up for the rest of their life. Now, one of the guys I was involved with murdered a witness when he was on the run for the first murder, and the other one attempted to kill a guard on his way out, trying to escape awaiting trial on various crimes. So then if you have the escapee cases or the prison murder cases, it's like, what else are you going to do? I mean,
yes, exactly.
But at least there was a logic behind it that was fairly consistent with prior Catholic teaching. Pope Francis just said, no, we're just not going to do it anymore. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
All right. Do you have any other thoughts on this chapter?
I think I had enough at the end there. I went a little rambling monologue.
Yes, you kind of did.
Well, you know what?
No, I said I did. I'm not complaining. It was a good rambling monologue. But this has been Season 8, Episode 10 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
Next time we'll be talking about, what are we talking about? Regulation in the environment.
I think we'll do 2 chapters.
2 chapters,
because that's a short one, and I think his the depth of his writing is getting thinner and thinner.
Yes, but then he moves on to the culture wars, from affirmative action to the arts, which sounds like it'll be a longer section. That'll probably be the most of what we talk about next time. So we'll have to limit our regulation in the environment.
That's much.
Who cares about the environment? Yes. All right.